First, a couple of brief comments here. I mean, first, coming at the end, I qualify, writing qualifiers all the way along, all day long, in light of each talk, and I have to say this, I need to correct that, and so on. And the risk at the moment is, as I look at my papers, it actually now has ceased to be a paper. It's a pile of notes. So hopefully there's still a thread of an argument there. Okay, so what the title I was given was the Lumen Gentium and the Missionary Task of the Church, and I added a subtitle. In the beginning was the Word, and I'll explain that in a moment. Just very briefly, I mean, the paper in its original form is much longer and a lot of linkage with Lumen Gentium and ad gentes, but in the interest of time, I focused on the core of the argument. So, and the argument is, so taking the mission of the church and presuming quite a bit from Lumen Gentium and ad gentes, I focus on the heart of the church's missionary task as the merciful love of God. And I do that because it is, and also because it's been a particular focus in the current papacy and in the church, and of course also was central for John Paul II and Benedict. I mean, John Paul II's great encyclical, Rich in Mercy. So I'll focus on that argument. Now, what is the argument, and I'll get started in a minute here, is just basically an attempt to focus the root principles that support realization of the task of missionary love. And I should, final qualifier here is that I approach this from the perspective of fundamental theology. So I'm trusting that all the real theologians in the room will correct me and complete my argument as necessary, because I'll be dealing with things that go beyond fundamental theology. So first, just to set it up, a few texts from Evangelii Gaudium. Pope Francis's apostolic exhortation, Evangelii Gaudium, insists that we need to anchor our approach to the church's missionary task in the incarnate word as the principle of reality. That's where I get my subtitle. So let me say what he means by that. There are a lot of things linked with that. Citing John Paul II, Francis states that the task of preaching the gospel is the first task of the church. This implies that missionary outreach is paradigmatic for all the church's activity. Francis says that this outreach demands ecclesial conversion. Every renewal of the church, according to this decree, essentially consists in an increase in fidelity to her own teaching, her own calling. Christ summons the church as she goes her pilgrim way to that continual reformation of which she always has need. I'm not giving the sources here, but this is all from the exhortation. The integrity of the gospel message must not be deformed, and each truth must be related to the harmonious totality of the Christian message. At the heart of that message, Francis points out, lies the view of St. Thomas that mercy is the greatest of the virtues. As such, it is proper to God to have mercy, through which his omnipotence is manifested to the greatest degree. Francis says it is important to draw out the pastoral consequences of the Council's teaching in this light. I dream of a missionary option, he says, which is capable of transforming everything so that the church's way of doing things can be suitably channeled for the evangelization of today's world rather than for her self-preservation. And here he cites John Paul II. All renewal in the church must have mission as its goal if it is not to fall prey to a kind of ecclesial introversion. In light of these concerns, Francis states, citing both John Paul II and Benedict XVI, that for the church, the option for the poor is primarily a theological category. God shows the poor his first mercy. This option for the poor, as Benedict XVI has taught, is implicit in our Christian faith in a God who became poor for us so as to enrich us with his poverty. Stressing the principle of the reality of ideas, priority of reality over ideas. Realities are more important. The subtitle of that section, realities are more important than ideas. Francis states, ideas that are disconnected from realities give rise to ineffectual forms of idealism and nominalism, capable at most of classifying and defining, but certainly not calling to action. What calls us to action are realities illuminated by reason. This priority of realities and rejection of ideas that are disconnected from realities, the Pope says, has to do with the incarnation of the Word and its being put into practice. The principle of reality of a Word already made flesh and constantly striving to take flesh anew is essential to evangelization. So he goes on. Ideas must be at the service of communication, understanding, and praxis. Otherwise, they will be incapable of calling us to action. Indeed, they will involve such things as the following. And all of this is in his words. Angelic forms of purity, dictatorships of relativism, empty rhetoric, objectives more ideal than real, brands of ahistorical fundamentalism, ethical systems bereft of kindness, intellectual discourse bereft of wisdom. Formal nominalism, Francis stresses, must give way to harmonious objectivity. So I wish in my paper to reflect on the missionary task in light of this. Reflect on the missionary task, and it's, well, first just say the point here is all those principles are true, seems to me, rightly understood. So the basic question is how do we avoid the problems? I mean, what's the connection there? So what I want to do in my paper is reflect on the missionary task and its primacy of mercy in terms of the relation between ideas and reality in the context in which Francis rightly frames it. That of the incarnate Word taking flesh and indeed expressing itself in practice, hence the subtitle of my paper. In the beginning was the Word, NRK ho logos. The simple point is somewhat obvious, in the beginning that this is not sort of chronological beginning, but an ontological beginning. So the structure of my argument very simply is if merciful love, then recuperation of the firstness of the word logos of God. That's sort of the condition. Now I want to unfold that, and I'll do it very quickly, just enough to maybe be provocative. But I want to say a word about ideas, words, the Word incarnate in Jesus Christ, and the sacramentalizing of that Word of Jesus Christ. And then finally, a general comment about what all that has to do with the realization of mercy, which is the fundamental task of the church. So ideas, what's an idea? In this context, trying to answer his problem. Problem is disconnection of ideas from reality, okay? And it leads to all these things he named. First of all, we may say that for the heart of the ancient and medieval tradition of Christian thought, ideas were in principle integrated with reality. That indeed is, for example, the burden of St. Thomas's understanding of truth as a transcendental, of truth that is as convertible with being. For Thomas, every being is true because it is related to an intellect. Every being is related to God's creative mind or intelligence, and every being is so far inherently intelligible and intrinsically apt for being known by human beings in their spiritual capacity. Key here is the principle of form, which Thomas, of course, inherits from the Greeks, Aristotle. Form is the immaterial principle in a thing that makes a thing what it is, and the human soul in its spiritual nature is the place of forms, so to speak. Indeed, the human soul, anima, for Thomas, following Aristotle, is quidamado omnia. The soul, in a sense, is all things. What we call an idea, then, is basically another word for form, which is that in a thing which enables its being known by another. It's being taken up into a relation with human intelligence that does not distort, but on the contrary, precisely releases the inner meaning of the thing to the knower. Every being thus bears an aptness for generous communication. By its very nature as a creature, each being is apt for true relation and thus community with humans through the latter's cognitive spiritual capacity, a capacity which itself is by nature for community. It is in this light, then, that we should say that ideas bear an intrinsically word-like character. Indeed, are most properly understood as words, intelligent communications rooted ultimately in God's creative, intelligent activity. Indeed, this is how Thomas resolves the Platonic problem of multiple ideas or forms that transcend the particular beings in which they are present. Indeed, they're meant to be gathered up. Meant to be gathered up in this, the single, and in creation are, in the single divine word of God revealed in Jesus Christ. Forms are the created words spoken by God that render each created being intelligible at once in itself and as apt for interior community with all creaturely, spiritual, intelligent beings, in some sense with all of being. The understanding of ideas that would disconnect them from reality then has its origin not in an authentically Christian way of thinking, but rather in the moderns for whom beings are no longer inherently intelligible, no longer inherently generous in a way that enables genuine realism. That is, a genuinely realistic relation between the mind, human mind, and things. At the heart of the problem of the moderns in this connection is the loss of the notion of form as the most basic principle of being. With the loss of form comes a kind of opaqueness in things. Each thing, as it were, reduces simply to what it is in an external sense. Things are no longer known in and through interior causes such as form and finality, but rather only through external causes that are conceived basically in a mechanical material manner. Ideas in this context then become abstractions. That is, having lost rootedness in the principle of form, ideas can no longer convey the inner meaning of things, nor do things bear any inherent intelligible relation to the divine mind. Knowledge ceases to be a matter most basically of generous relationship and community between things and human beings, and indeed ultimately with the Creator God. Knowledge, on the contrary, reduces most basically to an external relation that as a matter of principle tends toward distortion by virtue of what is now an inner tendency toward forceful, instrumentalized, and controlling abstraction. And I believe this can be shown in different ways in a number of modern thinkers, Descartes, Bacon, Locke, Hume, and Kant, for example. As Professor Kenneth Schmidt says, when the 17th century philosophers threw out the four causes, they not only cast aside Aristotle, they also disavowed the transformed senses of these principles and thereby begin the elimination of the intelligibility from the very notion of creation, which ceased to play a role in the modern understanding of reality. Okay. A little footnote to that, we can put this question then, and there's so many spin-offs in this, about the question of objectivity and subjectivity, which is so operative, widely spread in discussions about the question of mercy. Objectivity and subjectivity. Objectivity comes from the Latin obitio or objatio, what is thrown up over against one, We may say thus that what is given to me, what we call an object. Subjectivity, on the other hand, comes from what is subjectio, what is thrown up from within myself. We may say thus, what comes from me as a subject. The critical but crucial point then is that objectivity in its customary modern sense, what is objectively given, is merely a datum, bearing external machine-like characteristics, and always threatens to be somewhat oppressive and so on with respect to the subject. Objectivity in the medieval Christian sense, on the contrary, is rooted in the form indicative of the order of the thing itself, which order indeed is a creaturely participation in the creative mind of God. Objectivity is tied most basically to the spiritual creative intelligence characteristic of God as the personal logos of love. What is given in this light then is thus a datum that is from the inside out a donum, a gift or a present. That's point one. So that's then the next point, ideas as words. That's already implicit in this. This then is what I mean most basically when I say that ideas bear a word-like character. Ideas rightly understood precisely do not fragment or wrongly extract from reality. On the contrary, they reveal reality in its most profound sense. Knowledge is at root a way of letting things be, giving objective form to things as they are most deeply given in themselves in relation to the creative intelligence of God. They are thus, in the most literal sense, communications indicative of the forms of love. Thinking is essentially loving, and loving is essentially thinking, a representation of another. Though thinking does not exhaust what is meant by love, nor does love exhaust what is meant by thinking. Okay, third point, word and sacrament. Here I turn to the relation of this, the word then to sacramental word. Here I turn to the work of Alexander Schmemann. He says, the Western Christian is used to thinking of sacrament as opposed to the word, and he links the mission with the word and not the sacrament. The sacrament is recognized as essential, but as a clearly defined part or institution or act of the church and within the church, but not of the church as being itself the sacrament of Christ's presence and action. The difference, Schmemann states, is primarily a difference in the apprehension of reality itself, a difference of worldview. If for the Father's symbol is a key to sacrament, it is because sacrament is in continuity with the symbolical structure of the world in which omnes creaturae sensibiles sunt signa rerum sacrum, the words of Thomas Aquinas, that all sensible creatures are signs of sacred things. The world is symbolical. It's a sign of the sacred in virtue of its being created by God. To be symbolical belongs thus to its ontology, the symbol being not only the way to perceive and understand reality, a means of cognition, but also of participation. It is then the natural symbolism of the world, one can almost say its sacramentality, that makes the sacrament possible and constitutes the key to its understanding and apprehension. The Christian sacrament is, of course, unique and absolutely new, but this newness is best seen as a discontinuity conceived not as a miraculous exception to the natural order of things created by God and proclaiming his glory, but as a fulfillment. Schmemann's concern then is the separation of figura et res veritas et figura, the reality, so figure and thing, figure and truth. The reality of the sacrament, the real presence of the body and blood of Christ in the Eucharist, is detached from its symbolical reality. Drawing from the work of Henri de Lubac, Schmemann argues that the figura and the res, the mystice and the vere, cannot be rightly disjoined. The sacrament needs to be understood in terms of a causality that is not extrinsic and formal, but on the contrary, intrinsic and revealing. So we come here to a crucial point, which is this goes to the heart of modernity, which is for him modern secularism. And what is that? He says that the crisis of secularism is the great confusion, indeed the great heresy of our time. What is it? Secularism, according to him, consists in a false conception of the autonomy of the world or of the natural, and in a dichotomy between the natural and the supernatural. In both views, the world ceases to be the natural sacrament. That is, the world is denied its natural sacramentality, and the supernatural sacrament to have any continuity with the world. So he's clear about this. Secularism doesn't mean that, in his sense, it's not restricted to those who don't accept the idea of God, and he says it can include those who relate to God their ultimate aspirations to a just society and the freedom and equality of all men. None of that gets to the point. What's the point? The point is this: the fundamental rejection of epiphany. Okay? Hope you recall what I said about idea. The fundamental rejection of epiphany, the primordial intuition that everything in this world and the world itself not only have elsewhere the cause and principle of this existence, but are themselves the manifestation and presence of that elsewhere. And that this indeed is the life of their life, so that disconnected from that epiphany, all is only darkness, absurdity, and death. This rejection of the world's and man's inherent sacramentality, Schmemann says, entails reducing symbols, quote, to mere illustrations of ideas and concepts, for example, like peace, justice, or even God. The point is that secularism consists at its heart in a false notion of man's relation not only to God, but also to the world. And he says the result is, if this is fractured, the result is that liturgy becomes an exercise in mere piety, and human intelligence is released into rationalism. And the point here, that also a sub-point here, but it's important in terms of our earlier discussion, actually our first paper today on liturgy, it's very clear. He then emphasizes here how this notion of sacrament is the symbolic dimension is essential to seeing the inner order of sacrament to liturgy. That is, if that's abstracted from a sacrament, becomes a closed and self-contained means of grace and deprives the liturgy of its proper function. And there's a lot more I could say here, but in terms of time, but this is a very crucial point. I think it's the key that the sacramentality and the liturgical function can't be. They just can't. They're unified at the core. Anyway, I'll come back to that in certain form later. Okay. Now, so then the final point here is to return then with all of this. What does this have to do with mercy? To return to the subtitle of the paper. In the beginning was the Word. The text continues, and the Word was with God. All things were created through him, and without him was made nothing that was made. The Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and so forth. It is in these words of John's prologue that we find the root meaning of the scriptural text cited by Benedict and Francis, and indeed recorded in the title of John Paul II's second encyclical. It is God who is rich in mercy, whom Jesus Christ has revealed to us, manifested him, and made him known to us. God, who is rich, took on our poverty so that we might become rich with his poverty. The incarnate Word, then, reveals the meaning, the objectively given meaning of God to be being with. Balthasar, in a wonderful homily that he prepared for Trinity Sunday, puts the point succinctly, and I read some text from this. I quote, "We suffer with Christ. We are crucified with him. We die with him. Thus, Christian action means rejoicing with those who rejoice, weeping with those who weep, simply being with all those with whom God is. The fact that we did not want to be with the Son, but crucified him, is taken by our redeeming God and used in a deeper context, namely, that the Son took upon himself our refusal to be with him. He was with us in this very form." He goes on, "Whatever we regard as the ultimate meaning of human life is fulfilled in the original prototype, in the life of the eternal with." He thus asserts, and the feast of the Trinity is not some recondite mystery, rather it is he asserts that the feast of the Trinity is not some recondite mystery, rather it is the sum of all feasts. The recurring meaning of all feasts, Christmas, Good Friday, Ascension, Pentecost, is God with us. But how could God be with us if the Word were not part and parcel of his own being and life? Balthasar concludes, "At the root of all being whatsoever, there is the mystery of an interplay that both presupposes and actually produces a being with. Indeed, being itself is nothing other than this mystery. It is the origin and end of everything that participates, however fleetingly and superficially, in being." It's been a while since I've heard a homily like that, actually, on a Sunday. The burden of John's text in sum is that the Logos of God incarnate in Jesus Christ reveals just this being with as the form, the morphe, of God, and thereby of God's richness as love. It is the richness of God that needs to be shared above all with those who are most vulnerable and broken and the little ones who are often invisible. We come then to the summary point. The reality of God as being with is the beginning and end of what is meant by merciful love. But this being with, this merciful love, bears an objectively given form. It is the sacrament of the Word of God, revealed in a properly sacramental way in the church, and in a primordially sacramental way in and as the nature or natural order of creaturely beings who are destined to be taken up and transformed in the sacrament of the church, the Eucharist. The sacramental order of redemption and this pre-sacramental order of creation, then, are that in and through which I, as a creature and as a Christian, am first a subject of God's merciful love. These orders, at once distinct and as integrated into the Eucharistic body and blood of the incarnate Word, indicate the first and abiding objective form of God's merciful love, the love which indeed reveals and establishes me as one with whom God has granted a share in being and indeed his own being, thus revealing me and rendering me into a being now rich in love. God became poor for us in order to enrich us with his poverty. The result, the point here is then, those are the 5 points. So the point here is that we discover that a merciful love that is abstracted from this objectively given form, that's objectively given as nature, as already a sacrament of God's love in the natural order, and just given supernatural form in the sacrament of the church. If we abstract from that, by definition, this is what has to be sorted out, is that the question then is what mercy can possibly be. In other words, mercy by definition then, if it's abstracted from this, so this is the concrete, what an idea means concretely if it reveals the objective order of God's love, the objectively given order that forms me and enables me to exercise. It's my first participation, created and redeemed participation in God's love. If you remove that, the problem is then mercy becomes a reality rooted in a subject outside this objectivity. That is, it becomes inherently subjectivistic. Also, it becomes now something that has yet to be achieved by human subjects. Therefore, it becomes idealistic, becomes asymptotic. It's not rooted in something that's given, it's something yet to be achieved. And you can sort out further that there's a nominalism implied in that, and I would say also a Pelagianism. That's the heart of the argument. If you see that, we can explore it. So the result, in a word, if we abstract, is that from this objective order of nature and the supernatural is a merciful love that is in principle at once idealistic, a matter of a journey whose end, by definition, is realizable only asymptotically and subjectivistically, which are features that Pope Francis expressly rejects as incompatible with the Church's mission of mercy. So, the point is, summary point, affirmation of the indissolubility of ideas in their properly, naturally, and supernaturally sacramental meaning is the necessary condition for a genuine hope that there is such a realistic, non-subjectivistic thing as merciful love, which indeed would alone be able to sustain the hope that each of us, every last one of us, can and will be loved, quite literally, to the very end, by the eternal Word of God signified in creation and truly symbolized in the Church and the Eucharistic sacrifice as being with. I'm over here. There are some questions that we could go into. I mean, how this is concretely debated, but you see the structure of the problem. Okay, the sacramental vision and mercy. They stand or fall. If they're separated, mercy becomes idealistic, nominalistic, Pelagian, and subjectivistic is my argument. And but there's one thing I would like to develop here, but it takes us far, is if this is true, what I said, then when we look at the Church's mission, an institution that becomes extremely important, that's often forgotten in the question of the Church's mission of mercy, and that's the university. That is, and I could say a lot about that, and I think the work of Pope Benedict XVI is extremely important here. And what do I mean by that? The burden of my argument is that the problem regarding ideas has to do with the modern disconnection of ideas from reality as a modern phenomenon. It's not built into the Christian tradition. It's a modern phenomenon. And the question then is, where is the place where this issue needs to be dealt with, right? The question of the relation of ideas and reality. You need a critique of modernity. And this is what Ratzinger places constantly right at the heart of the task of the university. Any university that would be Catholic is a critique of modernity, not to reject it, but to transform and permeate. So that you, in other words, instead of to situate, to live out in a university setting, the unity of thinking and loving and thinking, recognizing neither exhausts the reality of the other, and also in terms of the objective order of the work of the special work of the academy, which, if this is true, there's a dominant sense in which the different of the order of the disciplines is tied to an analogy based on the idea of being as a machine. That is, of fragments that are brought into unity in a contrived way, and what is needed is a kind of an effort to open that up, an analogy, the order of the disciplines based on an analogy of being as being with. And then in that context, you can retrieve all of the tasks of a modern university, but there's a lot at stake in that. So I simply make that because there's a reason why Benedict XVI comes back to this so often. And it seems to me it's very much tied with this, tied to this larger point. So you see that. So the final thing that I simply summarize in three large summary statements as follows. First, that are implied by my argument, the thesis. First, a culture that has lost its mind, that is, it lacks lacks ordering by the pre-sacramental word of nature expressed in the order of creation, and the sacramental word of the church expressed in Jesus Christ and his Eucharist, lacks the principled capacity to exercise genuine mercy. Second, the mission of the church is always, but in an especially urgent way in the present cultural situation, to keep her word, her sacramental word of love, in and as the orders respectively of creation and redemption. And then thirdly, only by preserving her sacramental word does the church retain the capacity and obligation for continuing reform of herself, semper reformanda, coincident with a capacity for a principled capacity and obligation to accompany every human being without exception, indeed every aspect of every being in the cosmos to the very end, renewing and assisting in the salvation of all, so that God's merciful love can be all in all. Thank you very much.